Walking to Göbekli Tepe.
Cool.
How you feel, Mile?
Oh, I am stoked. I am so stoked. I watched that weird hype trailer in the you know, visitor center, and I've never been more ready for anything in my life. We are currently on the road to probably one of the best known archaeological sites in modern history. Although its history is anything but modern, the reason it has found itself in the limelight of the science community is because of just how old it is. It's a site that dates back a staggering 12,000 years to the Neolithic period, a site that predates agriculture by about 1,000 years. Howdy friends, my name is Milo Rossi, and today it is my great pleasure to welcome you to none other than the Potbelly Hill himself, Göbekli Tepe.
Today, Göbekli Tepe is one of the most well-known archaeological sites in the world. The site was originally discovered and identified as a place of archaeological significance as far back as the 1960s. However, it wouldn't be until 1994 that excavations would officially begin at the site. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt was responsible for the first major excavations at the site, and it is because of the diligent work of Dr. Schmidt and his dedicated team of archaeologists that we know much of what we do today about Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe has only been known to the archaeological and scientific community for around the last 50 years. However, the people who traditionally occupy these lands have a lasting memory of it that dates back much, much farther. In fact, the Kurdish people who have occupied this area for countless generations had a ceremony that they would perform atop this hill.
The story goes that at the top of the Potbelly Hill there was a single tree, and on the spring equinox, the Kurdish people of the local surrounding communities would go up to the top of the hill. They would walk around the tree, I believe 7 times, and they would hang a small piece of cloth from its branches, and it was believed that with each piece of cloth, a wish would come true. But because it has recently become the site of an excavation, this tree on top of this hill, which has been used for generations, has become a bit of a strike point for some controversy. While the Kurdish people would typically come up here about once or twice a year in order to perform their ceremonies, because this is now an archaeological site, many of them have been restricted from doing this. Now, I heard that the original tree was actually lost during excavation of this site, but the Kurdish people believe less in the significance of the tree and more of the location, so another tree was planted to sort of take its place. However, even if the Kurdish people were allowed to perform the rituals that they have been for hundreds if not thousands of years, it's pretty easy to see how the presence of this archaeological, now tourist site can interfere with their ability to do that. With this wooden boardwalk and a paved area around the tree, and all of it confined to a very small area. Now, what's even more interesting about this is that the people who would perform these rituals would then eat off of stone pottery from the site. Pottery which we now know to be about 12,000 years old, predating just about every other archaeological site ever found with this level of complexity. So it's kind of interesting to think that while this may be a new site to us, to the people of the area, this is something which has likely been handed down for generation upon generation. This is the fun part of the tour where Henry gets to walk forwards and I get to walk backwards. So, as we walk up this boardwalk, we're approaching the main enclosures of Göbekli Tepe. This is going to be my first time seeing them, so I am really excited. This is something that I've been looking forward to pretty much as long as I've known about this place, so I am over the moon that it's finally happening. I don't have words. I might need to just sit here for a bit before we film anything else. My brain is just like...
Half an hour processing first.
Yeah, oh my... How am I supposed to act professional when I'm standing in front of this? Oh my gosh. I'm camouflaged right now. What's up, guys? My name's Milo. I'm the guy whose YouTube channel you're watching. And while now I may be pretty good at talking, you know what else I'm pretty good at? Writing. That's right, baby, it's my book again. Look, I finally got to the point where I don't have to have a sponsor that I don't really care about for every video, so instead of having to watch a terrible sponsor read about something you don't want, I'm gonna advertise this, which I know you want because you're watching this video. For those of you who don't know, this is my first published book, The Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful by me. It doesn't say me on it, it says the fuck is this guy? The Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful contains 100 entries covering about 200,000 years of human history. From pets, board games, and ancient meals, this book has everything. And it's also, I haven't actually said this in any of the reads yet, but it's also illustrated. The drawings are like really awesome. That's probably a major selling point, but I kind of forgot to mention it. So it's perfect for all you fellow ADHDers out there who don't feel like sitting down and looking at a book that has nothing but words in it for hours upon hours. Also, each entry is only like 600 words at most, so it's not like completely overbearing to read. The format and structure is kind of an experimental thing that I decided to try. I'm not going to bore you with it right now, but if you'd be curious to hear more about it, there's a link to the video where I announced this book in the description of this video. And I would say it's going to be in a card above me, but let's be honest, I'm not going to remember to do that. But the Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful is available for pre-order now on Amazon. Link to that is in the description of this video. But anyway, remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and why am I giving an outro at the end of an ad read? Let's get right back into it. It's truly the complexity of Göbekli Tepe that makes it so unique. Up until very recently, archaeologists were under the impression that large-scale megalithic architecture was something that could only arise with the advent of agriculture, as once a community and a civilization has a pretty much inexhaustible supply of food, they could focus their energy into large-scale architectural projects and not have to be worrying about hunting and gathering. However, Göbekli Tepe is an outlier, where it was built at a time where, as of right now, we have no evidence that they were practicing agriculture in this area. However, the first widely accepted evidence of agriculture actually takes place about 1,000 years after Göbekli Tepe's construction, and only about 20 kilometers away from here. Now, there's not sufficient evidence for it yet, but if I were to give an educated guess, I would say that in the next couple years, we would likely find evidence that Göbekli Tepe was actually built around the same time as the first agriculture. It's a well-known archaeological principle that the things that you find are never going to be the oldest things. It is just the oldest thing you have found so far. And so to call Göbekli Tepe the oldest site on Earth would be a falsehood. But as of right now, it is the oldest temple of this complexity that we have ever found. Whew. Whew. And a hill is right. Because I have been talking and walking up this hill, and wow, these ancient people were really in shape. To put this site into perspective of just how old about 12,000 years really is, the Sumerian clay tablets, some of the first writing on Earth, dates back to about 5,000 years ago. So this site is so immense that it is nearly twice that age. And that's an age that is hard to wrap your head around, an age where the Earth itself would have been different. It would have been in a transitional stage from the end of the last ice age into the beginning of the climatic period that we're in now. And it is this climatic period that would have likely given this site such an immense significance to the hunter-gatherer groups that would have converged here. Because these hills, while slightly green today, would have been much more lush. The climate would have been wetter and cooler and allowed for a much more diverse array of wildlife. And this is part of the reason why people think that they were able to construct this without large-scale agriculture, because all of the resources they needed would have been available in the wild, just in the hills surrounding the site. Whether it be sheep, ancient cereal grains, and other livestock, it was pretty much all able to be found in the surrounding hillsides. And so as we stand on this overlook, one can imagine how strategic of a location this would have been for all of the communities in this area. Not only is it a place where you can see the migrations of animals in the valley below you, but it's a place where everyone from all of the areas around this would be able to coalesce and converge on top of this mountain.
Göbekli Tepe is home to 3 different layers. You'll be shocked to know that these layers are referred to as layers 1, 2, and 3.
The most recognizable part of Göbekli Tepe comes from what is referred to as layer 3. It is the oldest section of Göbekli Tepe, dating back nearly 12,000 years.
And is home to 4 enormous stone enclosures. Enclosures A and B are the smallest of the discoveries at layer 3, and they are situated on the southwest side of the dig site. And to the north and east are the 2 much larger enclosures. Enclosure C, home to a spectacular 3D relief of a leopard, and the enormous Enclosure D, home of the infamous and widely misunderstood vulture stone. The compounds of layer 3 are between 30 and 100 feet in diameter, and it is from these structures that perhaps the most infamous piece of Göbekli Tepe comes from, the enormous limestone T-pillars. Up until now, only 4 of these enclosures have been fully excavated, but geophysical surveying done at the hill surrounding Göbekli Tepe has indicated that there could be upwards of 16 more of these stone enclosures, each one potentially housing upwards of 8 individual T-stones, bringing the current estimated total of the amount of T-stones at Göbekli Tepe to around 200.
Now, all of these 4 main enclosures have a couple things in common. Every single one of them has 2 large T-shaped pillars that sit in the middle and face one another. All of these pillars are made out of the local limestone, the pillars of which were actually mined just about 100 meters away from here on the hilltop, and they would have been carried down here and placed into these flattened spaces that the ancient people would have carved and inserted the pillars into the ground. If you look down there, you can actually see the raised portions that are carved directly out of the bedrock itself. They would have carved a hole into the middle of this where they could have planted the large T-shaped stones into and then filled it in around in order to keep them standing. It's currently unknown as to whether or not these sites had roofs on them, but there's been a significant amount of evidence to suggest that there was. Some of this comes from the form of plaster, or the remains of plaster, which has been found on the walls. This would be something that would be delicate enough in the elements that probably would not be able to exist without a roof. And on top of that, if you kind of look around and use some of the context clues of the area, you can also piece together that there was likely roofs on a lot of these structures. For example, if you look down here, this is one that I just noticed, is you'll see these sort of notches on a lot of the top of the stones, and these look very indicative of something where you would be able to put a piece of wood in there, a piece of lumber that would eventually go up and meet something in the middle to create some sort of roof shape. There's similar flutings on the rocks over there. You can see one on the edge of the rock over there, and these are also heavily present at the enclosure on the far side that we're going to go look at in a minute. Now, one of the other features that is very common at this layer 3 piece of Göbekli Tepe is the iconography on the pillars. Every single one of them is adorned with all kinds of abstract and semi-realistic carvings.
The pillars of Göbekli Tepe are undoubtedly best known for their animal carvings, with the limestone reliefs featuring everything from lions, boars, foxes, donkeys, gazelles, reptiles, snakes, arthropods, and countless other living creatures.
And what is very interesting about this site is that there's no mythological creatures, there's no hybrids. Every single one is an animal that actually exists, meaning that the mythos of these people was not one that involved the creation or fabrication of, mythological creatures in order to sustain it. So if you look at this pillar right here, you can see a pretty famous depiction of one of the foxes, these sort of long shape, and this is not the only one at the site. Now, if you look at this pillar in the back, there's 5 cranes on the top of it and 2 wild boars, but 2 more animals that are very common throughout the pillars on this site. One of the most famous carvings of Göbekli Tepe is actually present on that pillar side there, and that is a leopard. It's one of the few that is sort of a 3D relief, one that fully comes off of the side of the pillar. The rest tend to be etched onto the surfaces with only a little bit of, 3-dimensional space. But this one is very large. The significance of that pillar is not entirely known, but a leopard is another piece of iconography that you will see not only here, but also at Karahan Tepe. And this is made all the more interesting because at Karahan Tepe, they have actually found evidence of leopard bones and leopards that show an actual leopard skin print, unlike a lot of the symbols which you find here. Now, most of these symbols found at Göbekli Tepe are animals, and in fact, there are almost no human figures found here. But 2 of the suggestions of human figures are actually on these 2 large pillars in the center of this enclosure. And now, they may not look like humans right off the bat, but if you look at the side, you'll see sort of this V shape, this triangular shape, and those are actually arms. Both of them reach down, and on the front of these pillars on the opposite side are hands. Around their waist is a belt, and on the front, right below where the hands meet, is a loincloth. And if we're to extrapolate this up, I guess that would make the top of these pillars, shoulders or something of that sort. But all of these figures don't have heads, and that is something else that you're going to begin to see as a theme as we walk through this site. So from this angle, you can see the hands that are wrapped around the front of the stone, as well as the continuation of the belt and the loincloth that hangs down the front. And the loincloth is another motif that we're going to see carried over not only in the human iconography, but in the animal symbols as well. It's also amazing to stand here and try and absorb how big these pillars truly are. When we were kind of in the entranceway, there's a model of the vulture stone, which I'll talk about in a moment, and you stand halfway up the vulture stone. It's immense. But when you look down here and you look at the vulture stone in comparison to the large T-shaped pillars in the center of this enclosure, these central pillars just dwarf this. Now, and I know that obviously we can't do it, but I wish that we could stand down there to really get a sense of scale for just how massive these stones truly are. The technical skill and manpower needed to move and erect these stones is just astonishing. It really proves that these people were highly sophisticated and worked together to produce something that is, it has withstood the test of time unlike any other ancient site in the world. Another amazing thing about enclosure D is the large T-shaped pillar, which has the person with the loincloth on it, is on a very decoratively carved platform carved directly out of the limestone bedrock. Around the base of this platform is more of the cranes which we have seen at other points in the site, except these ones are meticulous, carved out of the bedrock itself instead of onto the face of one of these stones. We don't actually see this at the base of the pillar next to it, and so these ones are sort of an outlier, but just a very unique little detail that you'll notice as you survey this site. There are also some of the few 3D carvings at the site, with the other notable exception being the leopard carving at Enclosure C. I came here with a whole script in mind that I'm, working to follow, but honestly, the most exciting part about this is just being able to look at this site and sort of piece together the things that you're actually looking at, because so much of it, it's just so rich, where everything you look at is almost a little discovery in and of itself. For example, if you look down here into the middle of this enclosure, you can see that the foot of some of these T-stones has these circular indentations that are, on opposite sides of the pillar. I don't exactly know what those are for, so I can't concretely give any evidence, but whether they are offerings or some sort of ceremonial space is really anyone's guess. One of the most famous but vastly misunderstood features of Göbekli Tepe is the infamous vulture stone, which you can actually see if you look right down here.
The vulture stone is best identified by its large, realistic motif of a vulture, as I'm sure you could imagine. Recently, there have been archaeological misconceptions that this stone represents some specific astronomical date. It has been claimed that this stone points to one specific star in the sky, and that the people who built Göbekli Tepe made this carving to warn us about some sort of calamitous event that ended up befalling them. The reason that some have been able to make this outlandish claim seem even remotely possible is because they don't show you any of the other context at the site. So let's put on our thinking caps for a moment and figure out what this stone could represent using what we know about the site. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were at a transitional state between agriculture and hunting and gathering, and the rest of the site shows countless motifs of animals. For this type of lifestyle, these people would have been entirely in tune with their surroundings. They would have been aware of every animal's range, behavior, and migratory schedule and extent. Because of this, one of the running theories as to what the vulture stone is actually a calendar. But it is not a calendar pointing to the end of the world. In fact, it's a calendar that is most likely not even astronomical. Instead, it divides the year into two seasons, the dry season between May and October, and the wet season between October and May. Therefore, these stones suggest that the seasons were not determined by the stars, but by the animals around them. These animals would have all had cyclical and predictable cycles of hibernation, migration, and mating seasons. One of the most common motifs found at Göbekli Tepe is none other than the crane, one of the most infamous migratory birds. Cranes did, and still do, enter this part of Turkey around the beginning of the wet season, or our winter time. And so their arrival would have been something that people would have anticipated year after year. The vulture stone not only shows these cranes, which were a harbinger of the wet season, but it also shows a large relief of a scorpion. During the dry season, people would have little interaction with scorpions, as they would be out in the fields and in their burrows. However, during the wet season, the increased amount of water would force scorpions out of their nests and into other dry places, frequently inhabited by people, meaning that even though they coexisted at all times of the year during the wet season, the climate would have forced these two organisms together. Further evidence for this being a calendar stone come from what appear to be sheaves of wheat or some sort of grain in the fields. And finally, the protrusion on the vulture's stomach indicates that it could be pregnant, which would make sense considering that most vultures would lay their eggs during the winter months.
And above one of its wings is a circle. Now, some have claimed that the circle is supposed to be the sun. However, it's very unlikely that that is the case when you look at the rest of the site, because the rest of the site has an even more interesting theme, and that is a theme of severed heads. And this one appears to be holding one in its wing. Some even theorize that the carving directly above the circle is a human body that has been relieved of its head that is now falling onto the vulture's wing, while others claim that it's a crane, another piece of symbology which is very common at this site.
While this hypothesis has not yet been corroborated by the scientific community, it is one that at least takes into account the surroundings of Göbekli Tepe. We know for a fact that the people who occupied this site had a fascination with human skulls. In fact, from Göbekli Tepe alone, they have retrieved 3 pieces of human skulls, each of which bear an unusual carved shape in them. This, as well as countless other non-carved skull fragments found around the site and the statues, all of which bear no head, has led some archaeologists to believe that Göbekli Tepe was at one time home of a skull cult.
Now, well, some think that the animals found at this site could be a indication of a calendar or some sort of teaching tool for what animals to hunt. There's also theories that they were simply protectors or some sort of spirit. As you notice, there's a lot of, kind of scary animals there. Things like, leopards and bulls, these things which still exude the idea of power. Even the iconography of a vulture is something which is common in a lot of different cultures throughout the world today, with people in Tibet still practicing sky burials where they will allow their dead to be picked apart by these carrion birds and returned to the earth. And this is a symbol that we see played out time and time again by cultures and groups of people who are very in tune with their surroundings. And so it's amazing to try and think not only about the architectural and archaeological complexity of this site, but also the society that the people who lived here would have existed in. However, the true meaning behind this stone is still up for debate, but it's important when one is trying to actually interpret its meaning to not just look at this as an isolated piece in this massive and ancient site, because the biggest disservice that we do ourselves when trying to interpret these things is to neglect to try and interpret the rest of its surroundings. As this was not erected as a single piece, it was erected as a part of a large ceremonial center. So to neglect to talk about the intent of the rest of the site is doing no diligence and not really being able to fully inform the true history of the location. Now, in this smaller enclosure, enclosure B, we see a symbol that we actually saw on the other side, and that is the symbol of the fox. And I think here is a perfect time to talk about another reoccurring theme that we see at this site, and that is a theme of masculinity. Every single animal, save one at this site, is male, all of them displaying either a penis or other traits that are consistent with males of that species. Because of the frequency of male animals at this site, it's theorized that this place had something to do with some form of fertility rite. And now I know that that is the classic archaeological term whenever there is, something to do with human sexuality. But because of this reoccurring theme and a lot of emphasis put on it, it seems to be a fairly logical conclusion. But the motif of male animals at this site is a theme which cannot be overlooked, especially when looking at other sites that were inspired or at least related to this culture, such as Karahan Tepe, which still contains that male motif.
The lives that the Taz-Tepler people would have lived were incredibly harsh, with skeletal evidence suggesting that their lifespan may have been just around 35 years. With a short lifespan and high mortality rate, it makes sense that these people would have put a huge emphasis on reproduction. And to emphasize this point just a little bit more, archaeologists believe that these stones would have taken so long to carve that they would have been intergenerational projects.
Someone who started a T-pillar wouldn't even be alive to see it finished, so this is a place that is steeped in generation upon generation of work.
The construction of these sites would have been colossally labor-intensive, and evidence for the methods of construction can be found littered around the site. One of the best examples of construction at the site comes from an unfinished enclosure, today known as Building E.
You can see in the back behind me this sort of flat plane with these raised portions in the middle, and those resemble very heavily the bases of some of the larger enclosures that are higher up the hill. They would have been places where the ancient people would have smoothed out the limestone and created these notches where the large T-shaped stones would have been stuck in to stand in place. Why they abandoned this site, we're not entirely sure. We theorize that the stone itself just wasn't quite as workable as some of the other places, and they faced some technical challenges while doing it, and so they decided to focus their energy on a place that would actually yield the proper results. But not only is there the platform where one of the enclosures would have eventually stood, but there are also these two circular depressions right here, as well as this piece on the other side, which has sort of these small round divots in the ground. Now, I haven't seen too much about what this is theorized to be, but if I were to give any sort of educated guess, I would say that this is probably an attempt to dig a hole that just was never finished. So this could indicate sort of how some of these holes were dug in a middle phase. So they would, scoop out these things, be able to break off the connectors between them and slowly work their way down into the bedrock. If you look at the top of a lot of these pillars, it actually has very similar, impact marks. And we were kind of sitting here speculating, like, why do you think that is? And I think that it's probably, Occam's razor. It's the most simple explanation, which is just like, the people who built this knew that those were the pillars, the parts of the pillars that they weren't going to be able to see, so they just didn't bother to smooth it out like they did for the rest of it. So there you go. Humans will always cut corners when presented with an opportunity to. Now, because of its immense antiquity and complexity, the site of Göbekli Tepe has also been home to a whole lot of archaeological misconceptions, with some postulating that it is evidence of some lost advanced Ice Age civilization, and others going as so far as to say that it was built by extraterrestrial visitors. However, these concepts and theories all tie back to a very outdated archaeological principle known as hyperdiffusion, the idea that ancient people were all taught by one lost source, and that every group on Earth was somehow descended from a shared pool of knowledge. Now, this was a belief system that was much more common during the fascistic early days of archaeology, where many archaeologists were inspired to do this work because they were being paid by those who were searching for evidence that their culture was descended from a ancient lost master race. Now, with the scientific evidence that we have to this day, we know that this is not the case. With sites like Göbekli Tepe being so closely related to other things like Karahan Tepe, which is located a mere 50 kilometers away, we know that this is not a global diffusion, but a regional diffusion, something which we see played out time and time again in just about every cultural region of the world. Yeah, it's very windy. Yeah, I think they probably came up here to fly kites. Cultural diffusion is something which has influenced just about every culture around the world, and is something which archaeologists and anthropologists are all too familiar with. And this site is no different, with symbols such as the T-stones being found at the surrounding areas, as well as other Mesopotamian sites south of here. It's something which one only needs to use a little bit of critical thinking to realize that, you know, these people were in very close proximity with one another. Thank you, I would have died there. The people who lived in this area would have been very closely tied to one another. They would have been people who interacted with, hunted with, and even fought with one another. And so it's important that we don't oversimplify a site like this. It is far too easy for us to look at this and let our minds wander to the idea of lost advanced civilizations and aliens, when in reality it was built by people just like you and I, people who were motivated by their belief system just like you and I, people who wanted to live and love and to be able to create a home and hearth just like you and I. And so these are the stories that archaeology aims to tell, and we risk losing them as we try to oversimplify these sites and claim that they are just part of some master plan. In fact, cultural diffusion still plays a massive role in this site, as behind me is the very tree that the Kurdish people of this area would come and perform their ceremonies at. Now, one can argue whether or not they knew what was beneath their feet, or whether or not that knowledge had been handed down generation after generation, but one thing is for certain, and that is that this area contains an immense amount of cultural and spiritual significance. We too often see ourselves as being the end of history, a point where we are now just trying to dig up everything that has ever happened, or learn about the way that the world has always been. And it's far too easy to fall into that trap, especially as archaeologists and those with curious minds. But it's important to remember where we actually stand in this timeline, not at the end of it, but just merely at the most recent point. Someday the site around us will be completely different, unrecognizable. 1,000 years from now, we don't know if there will still be an archaeological site here, or if the boards that stand below my feet will be buried to be uncovered someday by somebody else. Probably the thing about Göbekli Tepe that speaks the most to me is just how much there is to learn. Places like Göbekli Tepe still have upwards of 18 enclosures that are buried below the surface, with only 4 full enclosures actually excavated, and just those 4 have been able to change the way that we think about human history. You can see behind me actually an active excavation, one that has not been revealed to the public yet, and this is just a small piece of the puzzle of this area. We are surrounded by hills that have known human habitation for as long as memorable history and before, with Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe being just 2 of many archaeological sites out here that we have yet to learn about. With a massive emphasis on European archaeology, this part of the world has been vastly left out of the history books, and so it still has so much to teach us. And with just these 2 sites excavated and changing the way that we think about the ancient world, it's amazing to think about the discoveries that are going to be coming out of here within our lifetime. And these 2 are just the tip of a veritable iceberg of historical finds. 40 other sites confirmed to exist in the area around me, and up to 120 being speculated, or at least existing in some form of local legend. And so it's compelling to think about how much more there is to learn directly below our feet. And so for anyone who is interested in archaeology and history and wanting to learn more about the way that the world works and the way that ancient people lived, I can promise you that there's going to be no place where more information is going to come from within our lifetime than here in Eastern Turkey. I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. Remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and I look forward to seeing you next time for an exclusive look at Karahan Tepe. As excavation began, they found nothing like Göbekli Tepe. Its research is in such a stage of infancy that it is not even open to the public. However, my team and I have been granted unique access to this site, and for the very first time, a real archaeologist and camera crew have been allowed to document its unique history. It is my humble pleasure to welcome you to Karahan Tepe.